Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.
Welcome to all.
History is made of stories.
In this episode, we'll be talking about KPIs for HR departments.
Since the 60s and the first works on human capital, the use of indicators in HR has been a sea monster of sorts, which few people dare to tackle head-on.
Some would like to see them used everywhere, because measurements are reassuring, because figures anchor legitimacy, because concrete proof is irrefutable, and numbers are concrete.
On the opposite end of the spectrum, others refuse to use them altogether, unwilling to reduce people to a collection of indicators, because it's not easy to define relevant indicators. When we want to assess quality of life at work, for example, we often use the rate of absenteeism as an indicator.
But what insight does that provide into deep-seated causes of suffering in the workplace, such as the destruction of meaning, contradictory instructions, less independence, etc.?
So, what indicators should we use in HR? What's the story?
There's a basic group of fairly classic HR indicators that's easy to put in place: turnover, absenteeism, and payroll metrics.
But these aren't performance indicators per se. You have to develop a real understanding of performance if you want to set relevant indicators.
Right, so that's the crux of things. You have to choose between two approaches: become an auditor who focuses on indicators, or use them to better understand progress made and kindle discussions about performance.
Even with complex topics, indicators can be useful as long as you keep in mind that the thermometer only tells you your temperature, not what illness you have.
If you understand that measurements are there to invite us to think about how to improve things, then you're on the right track. And you need to base it on a real understanding of the field and the business stakes.
It will be even more relevant if you address the relationships between different indicators, which goes to the heart of performance.
When you're deciding which indicators to monitor, there are many mistakes to avoid. Here are a few.
First and foremost, trying to measure everything. It's one mistake that will lead you to neglect other aspects or create a labyrinthine roadmap with too many goals. That will only succeed in getting people lost.
Next, avoid being overly focused on HR or a single analytical approach. Indicators should reflect the company's goals without distorting reality.
Another mistake in our non-exhaustive list is viewing any indicator as an absolute value.
To make this easy to understand, let's turn to a parallel when people confuse price and value. Sometimes the things with the most value have no price. Love and liberty, for example. An indicator cannot become a truth. You also have to account for what it doesn't measure.
To keep from falling into these different traps, you really need to define what you're trying to understand rather than simply implementing an indicator to measure a result.
Like we said earlier, you have to develop a real understanding of performance. Identify what you're looking to monitor or pilot, the end, before you select the means, in this case, the relevant indicators.
To stay connected to reality, you have to involve all stakeholders in developing these indicators. The debate will prevent representative biases and will highlight ways in which indicators may not correspond to reality.
Putting indicators to the test in the field is a good way to see if they make sense to those who are hard at work. It's also an opportunity to explain why indicators are worth monitoring.
And last but not least, you have to constantly reconcile what you'd like to do and what's available. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a bit of perfectionism to the goal.
If, with the available indicators, 80% of the problem is covered, it may not make sense to take things further. Focus on what is realistic.
To recap, when it comes to HR indicators, there are quite a few errors to avoid. To steer clear, you have to 1. Determine what you're trying to understand. 2. Think about it as a group and put indicators to the test in the field. And 3. Constantly reconcile what you'd like to do and what is truly possible. Is that right?
Exactly right. Way to make a long story short.
Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.